A 10-year-old girl walked through a crowd of reporters, looked a billionaire straight in the eyes, and placed 3 crumpled dollars on the table. 7 words. That was all it took to bring James Whitmore, a man worth $4 billion, to his knees. But what no one in that room knew was this: the little girl standing before him was the daughter he never knew he had. Her mother had died in the hospital he shut down. And somewhere, hidden by the one person James trusted most, was a letter that had been written for him, a letter that would change everything. The clock was already ticking, and Maya was already in danger. The morning light cut sharp through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Atlanta Grand Hotel's main ballroom, casting long gold stripes across a room packed with reporters' cameras and the particular kind of restless energy that only shows up when powerful people are about to say carefully prepared things. James Whitmore stood at the podium like he was born there. At 55, he carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who had never once second-guessed a decision in public. His silver hair was combed back just so. His charcoal suit fit like it had been stitched onto him that morning. Behind him, a massive screen displayed the logo of Whitmore Corporation, a sleek, modern design that somehow managed to look both expensive and trustworthy at the same time. Whitmore Corporation remains committed to the growth and revitalization of Atlanta, he said, his voice smooth and unhurried, the kind of voice that made people lean in without realizing it. Our new development project will bring over 3,000 jobs to this city and signal to the rest of the nation that Atlanta is open for business. Applause rippled through the room. A few reporters raised their hands. James pointed to a woman in the front row, a local anchor he recognized, the kind who asked questions she already knew the answers to. Mr. Whitmore, critics are saying the South Side development displaces long-standing communities. How do you respond? He smiled. He had answered this question 17 times in the past month. Progress and compassion are not mutually exclusive, he said. We have relocation packages, community investment funds, and that was when the room shifted. It started as a small disturbance near the back, a ripple in the crowd, a few heads turning, a murmur passing from person to person, like a wave gathering itself before it breaks. Security personnel near the side door straightened. A camera swung away from the podium, and then the crowd parted. She couldn't have been more than 10 years old, small for her age, with 2 braids pulled back tight, and a jacket that was just a little too big for her narrow shoulders, the kind of jacket that had clearly belonged to someone else first. She walked down the center aisle with the kind of quiet, deliberate focus that made grown adults step aside, without quite knowing why. In her right hand, she held something small, crumpled, green. James watched her from the podium. His press secretary, standing just off stage, took a step forward. James raised one hand slightly, a small gesture, almost invisible, and the man stopped. The girl reached the podium. She was shorter than the microphone stand. She didn't try to reach it. She didn't need to. She simply looked up at James Whitmore with a pair of dark, steady eyes and placed 3 crumpled dollar bills on the edge of the podium in front of him. The entire room went still. Not the polite stillness of an audience waiting for applause. Something deeper than that. The kind of stillness that happens when a room full of people suddenly understands that something real is occurring, something that no press release had prepared anyone for. The girl's voice, when it came, was quiet, but in that silence, it carried to every corner of the room. My mom passed away because of you. 7 words. James Whitmore had faced Senate committees. He had sat across from hostile CEOs and shareholder revolts and investigative journalists with thick folders full of difficult questions. He had never, in 30 years of standing at podiums, felt the ground shift beneath him the way it shifted in that moment. He looked down at the 3 bills. They were worn soft, with handling the edges, frayed, the kind of money that had lived in a pocket or a jar for a long time before being spent. He picked them up slowly. He wasn't sure why, and held them in his palm. Then he looked back at the girl. She hadn't moved. She was still watching him, with those steady dark eyes. And there was something in them, not anger, not the hot, bright kind anyway. Something quieter and more devastating than anger. Something that looked, if he was being honest with himself, almost like patience. Like she had been waiting for this moment for a long time and had made her peace with however it went. The cameras were rolling. He was aware of that distantly, the way you're aware of weather through a window. What he was not prepared for, what he could not have explained to anyone in that room, could not have explained to himself, was the sensation that moved through his chest when he looked at her. Quick and wordless, like a door opening onto a hallway he had no memory of. It vanished, almost instantly, swallowed by the noise of the room coming back to life around him. But his hand was trembling. James Whitmore closed his fingers around the $3 and stared at them, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he had absolutely nothing to say. By the time James's car pulled into the underground parking garage of Whitmore Corporation's headquarters, the world had already made up its mind about him. He knew it before he checked anything. He knew it from the way his driver's eyes stayed fixed on the road, a little too deliberately. He knew it from the 3 missed calls from his publicist, a woman who had survived 2 recessions and a congressional investigation without ever calling twice in one day. He knew it the way you know a storm is coming, not from the sky, but from the way everything goes quiet right before it hits. The executive elevator opened directly into the 42nd floor, his domain, for the better part of 2 decades, a space of clean lines, floor-to-ceiling glass, in the particular silence of serious money. Today, that silence felt different. 2 junior staffers near the copy room stopped talking the moment they saw him. A third one didn't look up at all. James walked to his office without a word. The wall behind his desk was made entirely of glass, looking out over downtown Atlanta like a painting that changed with the weather. Today, the city looked the same as always. Traffic crawling on Peachtree, the skyline catching the afternoon light, the world going about its ordinary business. But on the 3 monitors arranged across his desk, the ordinary world had been replaced by something else entirely. Every screen showed the same thing. The footage was shaky. At first, someone's phone held at shoulder height near the back of the ballroom. But the moment the small girl in the oversized jacket began walking down the center aisle, the camera steadied. Whoever was holding it understood the way people sometimes instinctively understand that they were recording something that mattered. 10 million people had watched it in 3 hours. The number sat in the corner of one screen, like an accusation. Beneath it, the comments scrolled faster than any human could read. Thousands of voices piling on top of each other, a wall of noise made of outrage and grief, and the particular fury of people who feel that something true has finally been said out loud. James stood in front of his desk and watched himself on the monitor, watched himself pick up those 3 crumpled bills, watched the expression move across his own face. An expression he didn't recognize, couldn't name, had no memory of deciding to make. His phone buzzed, then again. Then it simply stopped as though it had given up. A knock at the door. His executive assistant, a sharp, efficient woman named Carol, who had worked for him for 11 years and had never once knocked fewer than twice, opened the door just wide enough to lean in. "Sir, the board is requesting a statement by 4 o'clock. Your legal team is on hold, and there are currently 14 news vans parked outside the building." James didn't turn around. "The girl," he said. "The one from this morning. What do we know about her?" A pause. Carol was not a woman who paused. "Very little, sir. Her name appears to be Maya. She was accompanied to the hotel by a woman from a community advocacy group, but she apparently approached the podium on her own. No one on our end anticipated, find out more." He said it quietly without heat. "Where she lives, who she's with, everything." "Of course." Another pause, smaller this time. "Should I loop in Mr. Marsh?" Before James could answer, he didn't have to. The door opened fully. Daniel Marsh was the kind of man who entered rooms the way weather systems did gradually. And then, all at once, at 58, he was 3 years older than James, with close-cropped gray hair and the lean, unhurried build of someone who had spent a lifetime making difficult things look effortless. He had been at James's side since the early days, back when Whitmore Corporation was 2 men, a borrowed office, and a shared conviction that they could build something that lasted. James trusted him the way you trust the ground beneath your feet, completely and without thinking about it. Daniel crossed the room without acknowledging Carol, who slipped out quietly and pulled the door behind her. He stopped in front of the monitors, hands loose at his sides, and studied the footage with the calm, assessing expression of a man watching a weather report rather than a crisis. He watched for a long moment. Then he said simply, "I'll handle it." His voice carried no alarm, no urgency, none of the adrenaline that had been running through every other conversation James had that afternoon. Just those 3 words, flat and certain, the way a person speaks when they have already decided what comes next. He turned and walked back toward the door. And then, so naturally, that James almost didn't register it, Daniel reached back and turned the lock. The small metallic sound of it filled the room. James looked at the door, then at the monitors, where the footage was still playing, still looping, still showing that small girl in her too big jacket walking toward a podium like she had every right in the world to be there. He stood very still. Something about that sound, the lock, the quiet finality of it settled into the back of his mind, like a splinter, too small to see, but impossible to ignore. 8 months earlier, James Whitmore had been in a very good mood. That was the detail that stayed with everything. Not the paperwork, not the meeting, not even the decision itself. Just that small, ordinary fact, he had been in a good mood. The kind that comes from a strong cup of coffee and a morning run, and the particular satisfaction of a week that has gone exactly according to plan. He had signed 17 documents that morning before 10 o'clock. The closure authorization for Southside Community Hospital was the 9th one. It arrived in a leather folder, the way all documents of consequence arrived on his desk, clean, tabbed, pre-flagged at the signature lines. His chief of operations had walked him through the highlights the evening before the facility was operating at a significant loss. The building itself required costly structural updates, and the patient volume in the surrounding area had, according to the reports, stabilized at a level inconsistent with continued full-service operation. The language was careful and precise and designed to make a straightforward business decision sound like the responsible thing to do. James read the summary page. He initialed the tabs. He signed at the bottom. He was already reaching for the next folder when Daniel set a hand briefly on the back of his chair, not quite a touch more like a presence, and said, "Good call." James hadn't looked up. "Numbers don't lie," he said. Daniel had said nothing more, but if James had turned around at that moment, he would have seen the faintest trace of something cross the other man's face. Not pride exactly, and not relief exactly. Something quieter than either. The look of a man watching a long, carefully tended plan arrive at the outcome he had always intended for it. But James didn't turn around. He reached for the next folder. 40 miles across town, at the corner of Delmar Street and 9th Avenue, the morning told a different story. Southside Community Hospital had served this neighborhood for 31 years. It was not a glamorous building. 4 stories of weathered brick, a parking lot that flooded when it rained, a waiting room with chairs that had been reupholstered twice and were due for a 3rd time. But it was there. It had always been there, the way certain things in a neighborhood become part of the landscape so completely that people stop seeing them and simply rely on them, the way you rely on the ground being solid when you take a step. The notice had gone up 3 weeks before. A single sheet of paper, laminated and taped to the front doors. Effective October 14th, Southside Community Hospital will cease operations. Patients are encouraged to contact their insurance providers for alternative care facilities. By 7:30 that morning, there were already more than 40 people gathered on the sidewalk outside. They stood in the particular way that people stand, when they have arrived somewhere expecting something and found nothing instead. Not quite a crowd, not quite a line, just a collection of individuals absorbing the same unwelcome reality at the same time. An older man in a veteran's cap held a folded piece of paper that might have been a referral. A woman in scrubs, still wearing her name badge from a night shift somewhere, made a phone call and then stood very still after it ended. 2 teenage boys sat on the low concrete wall at the edge of the parking lot, not talking. A security guard, young clearly, uncomfortable, stood at the entrance and repeated the same sentence to anyone who approached the door. "I'm sorry. The facility is closed. I'm sorry. The facility is closed." The doors behind him were locked with a chain and a padlock that looked new. As the morning stretched on, the sidewalk filled. People called family members, who called other people. A local pastor arrived and stood with a group of elderly women near the corner, holding one woman's hand while she talked without stopping. A man in his 40s sat down on the curb at some point and simply didn't get back up. Nobody raised their voice. That was the thing. There was no shouting, no confrontation, no moment of dramatic rupture. Just the steady, accumulating weight of people encountering a wall where a door used to be. Near the back of the gathering, in the narrow strip of shade along the building's side entrance, stood a young woman. She was slight with tired eyes and natural hair pulled back under a headscarf. She held a little girl on her hip, a child of maybe 3 or 4, small enough to rest her head on her mother's shoulder with her eyes half closed, unbothered by everything happening around her. In her free hand, the woman held 2 pieces of paper. One was a prescription, handwritten, dated 10 days ago, for a medication she had not yet been able to fill because the pharmacy near her apartment didn't carry it, and the hospital's outpatient clinic had always been her backup. The other was an appointment reminder, printed on the hospital's letterhead, for a follow-up visit scheduled for the following Tuesday. She looked at both pieces of paper for a long moment. Then she looked at the locked doors. Then she looked back down at her daughter, who had fallen fully asleep, now her small fingers loosely curled against her mother's collar, breathing in the slow, total way that only children and the very exhausted can manage. The woman didn't move. She didn't approach the security guard or ask anyone for help. She just stood there in the thin shade, holding her child and her useless papers, while the morning went on around her, without pausing to acknowledge that anything had gone wrong at all. The city never went fully dark. That was something James had noticed over the years. Atlanta at night was never black, never quiet, never completely still. There was always a glow somewhere on the horizon, always the distant murmur of traffic on the interstate, always the sense of a place that had simply decided to keep going, regardless of the hour. He sat at his desk long after everyone else had gone home. The monitors were off. He hadn't turned them back on after Daniel left. The room was lit only by the single lamp at the corner of his desk, throwing a circle of warm light that didn't quite reach the walls. Outside the glass, the city glittered and breathed indifferent as always. At 11:47, he made a phone call. The man on the other end was someone James had used before, twice in circumstances that never made it into any official record. He was thorough, discreet, and expensive, which in James's experience meant he was worth every dollar. "I need everything," James said. "The girl from this morning, who she is, where she lives, who her family is." A pause. "Especially her mother." He hung up without waiting for a response. Then he sat back in his chair, looked at the ceiling, and tried to remember the last time his hand had trembled in public. He couldn't. The file arrived at 6:12 the following morning, before James had finished his first cup of coffee. It came through on his private line, an encrypted transfer, the kind that left no trail worth following. He opened it at his desk in the gray, early light, still in his shirt from the day before his jacket, folded over the back of the chair, where he'd left it sometime around 2 in the morning. The file was thorough. It always was. He read through the preliminary details. First, the girl's age, her enrollment at a nearby elementary school, her current residence at a transitional housing facility on the west side of the city. He read through the notes on the advocacy group that had apparently brought her to the hotel, a small nonprofit that worked with families in the South Side area. And then he scrolled to the section labeled Guardian Deceased. There was a name, and beneath the name, a photograph. It was a standard image, the kind pulled from a document or an old identification record, slightly pixelated from being enlarged. A woman in her mid-30s, natural hair, framing a face that was turned just slightly toward the camera, as though she hadn't quite decided whether she wanted her picture taken. The coffee cup slipped from James's hand. It didn't shatter. It was heavier than that, a ceramic mug that simply hit the edge of the desk and tipped, sending a slow spill of dark liquid across the corner of the file. James didn't move to stop it. He didn't move at all. He was looking at the photograph. Her name had been Diana. He hadn't said it out loud in 15 years, but it lived somewhere in the back of his memory. The way certain things do not forgotten exactly, just filed away in a place you don't visit. A name that belonged to a version of himself he had long since decided was no longer relevant. They had met in the spring. He remembered that clearly, the particular quality of the light that season, the way everything in the city had felt temporary and full of possibility at the same time. She had been working at a legal aid clinic downtown, the kind of work that paid almost nothing and required everything. And she had argued with him about income, inequality over bad wine at a mutual friend's dinner party. And he had thought somewhere, around the second hour of it, that he had never met anyone quite like her. What followed was the best 18 months of his life, and he had spent the decade and a half since then, making sure he was too busy to think about that. He had ended it on a Tuesday in March. He remembered the day, but not the exact words, only that he had been very reasonable about it, very measured the way he was measured about everything. He had used words like timing and focus, and the company needs me right now. Diana had listened without interrupting. When he finished, she had looked at him for a long moment with an expression he had never been able to fully decode, and then she had simply picked up her coat and walked out. He had told himself for 15 years that she was fine, that people moved on, that he had made the right call. He had been very good at telling himself that. James pulled the file closer and looked at the photograph again. Then he looked at the date of birth listed beneath Maya's name in the document. He was not a man who made computational errors. Numbers had always come easily to him naturally, the way language comes easily to some people and music to others. So it took him less than 4 seconds to do the calculation. Maya was 10 years old. Diana had walked out of his apartment 15 years ago. He sat with that arithmetic for a long moment, perfectly still, while the spilled coffee finished spreading across the corner of his desk, and the city outside his window began its slow, inevitable brightening into another morning. Then he set the mug upright. He closed the file. He stood, crossed the room to where his jacket hung over the chair by the door, and put it on with the careful, deliberate movements of a man who is concentrating very hard on not thinking about what he is thinking about. He did not tell Carol where he was going. He did not stop at the front desk. He walked to the elevator, pressed the button for the parking garage, and stood watching the numbers descend, with his hands very still at his sides, making sure this time that they stayed that way. He had driven past neighborhoods like this 100 times without stopping. That was the honest truth of it. And James was nothing if not honest with himself about the things that didn't cost him anything to admit. In 30 years of building and buying and developing across this city, he had driven past the West Side, the way you drive past, whether aware of it, occasionally inconvenienced by it, never particularly moved to pull over. The transitional housing facility on Clement Street was a converted 2-story building that had once been a small church. You could still see the outline where the cross had been removed. From above the entrance, a slightly cleaner rectangle of brick against the weathered facade like a scar that had healed but never quite disappeared. A hand-painted sign beside the door read, Clement Street Family Resource Center, in careful, faded letters. James sat in his car across the street for 4 minutes before going in. Inside, the air smelled like industrial cleaner and something warmer underneath its soup, maybe. or coffee that had been sitting on a burner since morning. The front room held a cluster of mismatched chairs, a children's corner, with a plastic bin of worn toys, and a folding table covered in pamphlets about housing assistance and food access programs. A bulletin board on the far wall was layered thick with handwritten notes and printed flyers, the edges curling with age. A woman looked up from the front desk as he entered. She was somewhere in her mid-50s, with reading glasses, pushed up on her forehead, and the particular expression of someone who has spent years dealing with situations that don't fit neatly into categories. She took in James's suit, his watch, his general air of not belonging here, and her expression didn't change in any way he could easily read. "Can I help you?" she said. Not unfriendly. Not the opposite either. "I'm looking for information," James said. He had decided somewhere on the drive over not to use his name. "About a little girl, Maya, and her mother." Something shifted in the woman's face. Not suspicion exactly, but a careful attention, the kind that comes from caring about something enough to be protective of it. "Are you family?" she asked. The word landed differently than he expected. "I knew her mother," he said. "A long time ago." The woman's name was Ruth. She had run the resource center for 9 years. She brought him a cup of coffee he didn't ask for and sat across from him at a small table near the window. And she talked about Diana, the way people talk about someone they genuinely miss, not performing grief, just carrying it. Diana and Maya had arrived at Clement Street 3 years ago, she said. Maya had been 7. They had come with 2 bags between them and a referral from a church on the east side, and Diana had been determined, in the particular way of someone who has already been through the hardest part and is simply focused on what comes next. She was resourceful, Ruth said. Proud, but not in a way that got in her own way. You know, she found part-time work within the first month, got Maya enrolled in school. She was always the one helping other residents figure out their paperwork, their benefits, their options. Ruth looked at her coffee. She should have been a social worker. James kept his hands flat on the table. She got sick about 8 months ago. Ruth continued, her voice evening out, in the way voices do when they're delivering information that still carries weight. It started as something manageable, a condition she'd been monitoring for years, apparently. She had a specialist at Southside Community, had been seeing him regularly. A pause. And then the facility closed. The words settled into the room. The nearest alternative was across town. Different transit lines, longer travel, and the wait list for new patients was considerable. By the time she got an appointment, things had progressed further than they should have. Ruth set her cup down carefully. She passed 4 weeks ago. Maya was with her. James said nothing. Outside the window, a group of children were chasing each other around the small concrete yard at the side of the building. Their voices came through the glass, muffled and bright, entirely separate from the conversation happening inside. Maya's been staying in her room, Ruth said. She goes to school. She comes back. She doesn't talk much, but she's not... Ruth paused, searching for the right word. She's not broken. That girl has something in her. Same thing her mother had. James stared at a point on the table between his hands. The day of the press conference, he said carefully. Did you know she was going to do that? Ruth was quiet for a moment. No, she said finally. But I can't say I was surprised. She'd been carrying that for a long time. She glanced toward the hallway that led to the residential rooms. She's a child who pays attention. Always has been. A silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, just full. Then Ruth leaned forward slightly and lowered her voice in the way of someone sharing something they have thought about for a while and decided just now to say. Her mom talked about Maya's father sometimes, she said. Not often, but sometimes late in the evenings when things got quiet. She looked at James steadily. Said he was a good man once. Said he just lost his way. She didn't ask any follow-up questions. She didn't need to. James looked down at his hands on the table. The same hands that had held 3 crumpled dollar bills the morning before. The same hands he had been carefully keeping still since he walked out of his office and found that he had nothing to say to that. Nothing that would have been honest anyway. He did not ask her anything more. Ruth had offered to walk him up herself. He had told her it wasn't necessary. That was the kind of thing James said automatically, reflexively. The way people say, "I'm fine," when someone holds a door, not because it was true, but because accepting help from strangers was not something he had ever learned to do gracefully. He found the room at the end of the second-floor hallway. Number 7. The door was ajar. He pushed it open with 2 fingers. The room was small and very clean, in the way that rooms get when someone has taken care of them, carefully, over a long time. A narrow bed against the wall, the blanket pulled up and tucked in with the particular neatness of a child who has been taught to make her own bed. A small wooden dresser, with 3 of its 4 drawers closed properly. A paper mobile hanging from the ceiling, cut from magazine pages, geometric shapes in blue and yellow and orange, turning slowly in the air that came in when he opened the door. Everything in its place, except Maya. James stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the room the way you take in a scene that doesn't yet make sense, cataloging details, looking for the thing that explains the wrongness of it. A jacket hung on the hook behind the door. A pair of sneakers were lined up beneath the bed toes, pointing out. A library book sat on the windowsill, a bookmark still in it, about a third of the way through. She had not packed. She had not taken her shoes. On the floor in the center of the room, sitting where nothing else sat, was a stuffed bear. Old and soft, from years of handling one button eye slightly lower than the other, the kind of object that becomes so fundamental to a child's life that its presence anywhere other than that child's arms registers as immediately, instinctively wrong. James crossed the room in 3 steps and picked it up. What followed was the first time in recent memory that James Whitmore operated without a plan. He went back downstairs with the bear still in his hand, which he did not notice until Ruth's eyes dropped to it, and he became suddenly acutely aware of how he must look. He asked Ruth with a steadiness in his voice that cost him something to maintain, whether anyone had seen Maya leave. Ruth's expression shifted into something urgent, and she called for her colleague at the back of the building. The colleague had not seen her. The resident in the room next door had heard the hallway door open around 4 o'clock, but had assumed it was Ruth making rounds. James called the authorities. He did it, standing in the front hallway of the resource center, and he did it using his real name, which meant that within 40 minutes of the call being logged, 3 news vehicles had positioned themselves on Clement Street outside. By the time officers arrived to take an initial report, there were cameras pointed at the building's entrance from across the street, their operators apparently operating on the assumption that wherever James Whitmore appeared, 2 days in a row, something worth recording was happening. They were not wrong, exactly. They were just filming the outside of the building, while everything that mattered was occurring inside it. James answered the officers' questions in the front room, while Ruth hovered near the hallway door, arms crossed, watching him with an expression that had moved past caution into something closer to open concern. The questions were straightforward. He gave straightforward answers. Yes, he had come to speak with the child. No, he was not a legal guardian. No, he had no prior relationship with her. The officers wrote things down. One of them recognized his name and worked visibly to keep his expression neutral. Through the front window, the cameras waited. James had spent 30 years understanding how rooms worked, who held the power, where the pressure was, what lever to pull to move a situation in the direction he needed it to go. He had walked into boardrooms, courtrooms, negotiating tables in 3 countries, and he had always known within the first 30 seconds what to do next. Standing in the front room of a transitional housing facility on Clement Street, holding a worn, stuffed bear, while uniformed officers asked him to spell his last name, he had no idea what to do next. That was the truest thing that had happened to him in a very long time. He went back upstairs after the officers finished. He wasn't sure why. There was nothing more to see in that room. Nothing that the officers hadn't already noted, nothing that would tell him where she had gone or why. But he went anyway, and he stood in the doorway of room 7 again, and he looked at the space where the bear had been. The floor was not quite empty. He moved closer, crouched down. Beneath, where the bear had been sitting, pressed flat against the floor, visible only because he was looking at exactly that spot, from exactly that angle, was a small piece of paper folded in half. He picked it up carefully. The way you handle something you're not sure you have the right to touch. The handwriting inside was a child's, the letters large and slightly uneven, the kind of printing that comes from someone who has learned to write with care, but hasn't yet learned to write fast. It was an address. James recognized it immediately, and completely, the way you recognize your own face. It was the address of the 42nd floor of the Whitmore Corporation building. His floor, his office, the place where less than 30 hours ago, Daniel Marsh had walked to the door and turned a lock and said, "I'll handle it," in a voice that had carried no urgency whatsoever. James folded the paper closed along its original crease. He stood up. He did not say anything to Ruth on his way out. He did not speak to the officers still making notes in the front room. He walked past the cameras outside without turning his head, got into his car, and pulled into traffic, with the careful, deliberate control of a man who has just understood that the situation he is in is considerably more serious than the one he thought he was in. The 42nd floor of Whitmore Corporation was not designed for children. That was obvious, in the way that certain truths are obvious only when you are confronted with evidence of them, the hard angles of the furniture, the abstract art on the walls that costs more than most people made in a year, the particular quality of the silence that expensive office spaces cultivate deliberately, as though stillness itself were a form of status. Everything on that floor communicated in the subtle language of design and material that the people who belonged here had arrived through a long process of becoming someone. The elevator doors opened and James stepped out and stopped. She was sitting in one of the chairs along the far wall, the ones positioned outside the main conference room, the chairs that visiting executives used while they waited to be acknowledged. She was very small in the large chair, her feet not quite reaching the floor. Her jacket pulled tight around her, even though the building's climate control kept the floor at a steady 71 degrees. Her hands were in her lap, both of them wrapped around a phone, old. The screen scratched a thin crack running across one corner, and she was holding it the way people hold things that are the last of something. She looked up when he stepped off the elevator. Neither of them spoke for a moment. James crossed the floor slowly, the way you move when you are not sure what the correct speed is for a situation you have never been in before. He pulled a chair from against the wall and set it down a few feet from hers, close enough to talk, far enough to not crowd her, and sat. "Are you all right?" he said. It was he immediately recognized an inadequate question, but it was the one he had. Maya considered it with the seriousness of someone for whom the question was not rhetorical. "I'm okay," she said. Her voice was steadier than he expected, steadier, he thought, than his own. "Who brought you here?" he asked. She thought about this carefully before answering, which he noticed the way she treated questions as things worth considering rather than things to respond to quickly. "A man," she said. "I didn't know him. He was waiting outside the center when I came back from school. He had a car." She paused. "He said someone at this building wanted to make things right. He said I'd be safe here." Another pause, smaller. He seemed like he was telling the truth. What did he look like? She described him briefly, older gray at the temples, a dark coat, the kind of description that could fit 100 men in this city. But James had spent enough time studying the people around him to narrow it considerably. His floor had its own private elevator access, coded separately from the building's main system. The code changed monthly. There were exactly four people who received the updated sequence. James was one of them. Daniel was another. He looked around the floor slowly, at the darkened conference room, the empty assistant stations, the row of closed office doors. Everyone had gone home. The cleaning crew didn't come until after 10. At this hour, on this floor, there was no one here but the two of them. He turned back to Maya. She was watching him with an attention that was slightly unnerving, in the way that children's attention sometimes is direct and unfiltered, the kind of looking that adults have generally learned to soften or redirect, because looking at someone that honestly requires something most people aren't willing to give. "Why did you come to the press conference?" he asked. She looked at him for a moment before answering. "Because someone had to," she said. It was not defiant. It was simply a statement of fact, delivered in the tone of someone explaining something they have thought through completely. Mom couldn't anymore, and somebody needed to say it. James looked at the phone in her hands. "Is that hers?" he asked. Maya's grip on it shifted, not tighter exactly, but more deliberate, conscious. "It's all I have left of her," she said. The air conditioning hummed somewhere above them. Outside, the floor-to-ceiling windows. Atlanta was doing what Atlanta always did at this hour, glowing and moving and continuing entirely indifferent to what was happening on the 42nd floor of one of its taller buildings. James sat with that for a moment. There were things he needed to ask. Practical things, responsible things about where she would stay tonight, about who her legal guardian was, about the appropriate channels for a situation like this. He was aware of all of them stacked up in the back of his mind, like a to-do list, waiting to be actioned. He asked none of them. Instead, he found himself simply sitting across from this child in the expensive silence of his own building, and for reasons he could not have fully articulated, he did not reach for his phone or stand up or take control of the room the way he took control of every room he entered. He just sat. And Maya, apparently finding this acceptable, looked at him for a long moment with those steady, dark eyes. Eyes that had been looking at the world straight on since before she had any particular reason to, and said, in a voice that was quiet and entirely matter-of-fact, "Do I know you?" She tilted her head slightly. "You look like someone my mom used to draw." The climate control hummed. The city glowed beyond the glass. James Whitmore sat very still and said nothing at all, and the question hung in the air between them, like something that had been waiting a very long time for someone to finally say it out loud. Maya had learned sometime in the past year that silence from adults usually meant one of two things. Either they didn't know what to say, which happened more often than grown-ups liked to admit, or they knew exactly what to say and had decided not to say it, which was a different thing entirely and generally more interesting. She had gotten fairly good at telling the difference. The man across from her was the second kind. She watched him the way she watched most things quietly, without making it obvious. He was looking at a point somewhere between her face and the window behind her, his hands resting on his knees, and there was something happening behind his expression that reminded her in a way she couldn't quite name of the way her mother used to look sometimes in the evenings when she thought Maya was asleep, like someone carrying something heavy in a place where it didn't show. "You don't have to answer," Maya said finally. "I ask too many questions." Mom always said that. Something moved across his face at the word mom, quick and involuntary, like a flinch that didn't quite make it to the surface. "What was she like?" he asked. His voice was careful, measured, the voice of someone choosing each word before releasing it. Maya considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things. She was the kind of person who noticed stuff, she said. Like if you were sad, she knew before you said anything. And she made really good rice and beans. She looked down at the phone in her hands. And she drew. A lot. Mostly at night after she thought I was asleep. What did she draw? Everything? Buildings, trees, our street. A pause. People. People she knew. Maya turned the phone over once in her hands, a small habitual motion, the kind that comes from months of carrying something everywhere. "Mostly one person," she said. "I never knew who it was." She never said. She looked up at him. But she drew him a lot. Same face, different angles. Like she was trying to remember something exactly right. The building hummed around them, the particular low-frequency sound of a large structure at night, all its systems running on a quieter register. Somewhere down the hallway, a light had been left on in an empty office, throwing a pale rectangle across the floor. James said nothing. Maya looked back down at the phone. "Mom left this for me," she said. "She made sure I had it before." She stopped, started again differently. She said to keep it safe. She said there were things on it that mattered. Did you look? James asked. Some of it. Maya's thumb moved to the cracked screen, pressing the button at the side out of habit. The screen lit up a wallpaper photo of Maya and her mother at what looked like a park, somewhere, both of them squinting into the sun, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. She had a lot of voice notes. She used to record herself when she was thinking through something. Said it helped her organize. She scrolled slowly, not quite looking at the screen, more feeling her way through something familiar. There's one at the end I haven't listened to yet, she said quietly. It's the last one she made. I kept. Another stop. I wasn't ready. James watched her hands on the phone. You don't have to, he said. Maya looked up at him. Then she looked back at the screen. I think maybe I am now, she said. It wasn't clear whether she was talking to him or to herself or to something else entirely. She pressed play before he could say anything further. The quality of the recording was uneven. The sound of someone speaking into a phone held close, the ambient noise of a small room, the particular acoustic flatness of a space without many soft surfaces. A breath first, then a pause, long enough that it seemed like nothing would follow. And then Diana's voice filled the room. It was not the voice James remembered from 15 years ago, or rather, it was but layered over with something else, a texture that came from years and difficulty, and the specific gravity of someone who has been carrying something important for a long time and has finally decided to set it down. She spoke slowly, deliberately, like someone who had rehearsed what they needed to say, but was still finding the exact shape of it as they went. If anyone finds this, if Maya finds this, or someone who needs to know, I want to say it clearly while I still can. A pause. What happened to the hospital wasn't an accident. It wasn't just about money or development or any of the reasons they put in the official reports. We were pressured. The community board was pressured. Certain information was controlled. Certain voices were kept out of the room. Another pause. Steadier now, like she had gotten past the part that was hardest to start. The man whose name is on the paperwork. I don't believe he understood what he was authorizing. I don't believe that. I need to say that because I think it matters. The recording shifted slightly. A small sound, like she had moved the phone to her other hand. But the man standing behind him, her voice changed on that phrase. Not louder, quieter, actually, with the particular careful quietness of someone making sure each word lands exactly where it's aimed. The man standing behind him knew everything. The recording did not end immediately. There were a few more seconds of ambient sound, the distant noise of a street somewhere below the soft rhythm of breathing, and then it stopped. The silence that followed was different from the silence that had preceded it. Maya sat with the phone in both hands, the screen still lit, not looking at anything in particular. Her face had the stillness of someone absorbing something at a level deeper than thought. James sat across from her and did not move and did not speak, because there was in the architecture of what Diana had just said a door he had not known existed, and on the other side of it, something was beginning to take a shape he recognized, and it was the shape of a name he had trusted for 20 years. Neither of them moved to stop it. That was the thing about certain moments. They arrive with their own gravity, and the people inside them simply go still and let them pass through. The phone screen had gone dark from inactivity, but the audio kept running, and the sound of Diana's breathing filled the space between James and Maya, like something alive, like a third presence in the room that neither of them had invited and neither of them was willing to dismiss. Then her voice came back. I need to back up, Diana said. I need to explain how it started, because it didn't start the way things like this usually start. There was no single moment. It was gradual, the way pressure usually is. A pause. The sound of her shifting position, a chair maybe, or the edge of a bed. About 14 months before the closure, the hospital board started receiving correspondence. Formal at first, inquiries about the facility's financial performance requests for operational data suggestions, about restructuring options. Standard language. The kind of language that sounds reasonable until you realize it's been designed to sound reasonable. Her voice was measured, pacing itself. The voice of someone who had organized these thoughts many times before, finally recording them. Then the correspondence became less formal. Board members started getting calls, personal calls, not to the hospital line. People they knew, or people who knew, people they knew. The message was consistent. The facility was a liability. The neighborhood was changing. There were better uses for the land and the resources, and those who understood that early would be better positioned than those who didn't. Maya sat with her knees pulled up, the phone resting on the chair arm beside her. She was very still. James was not sure she was breathing. I was working with a patient advocacy group at the time. We had documentation, utilization, data, community, health outcomes, letters from residents. We requested time before the board. We were granted 15 minutes. 3 months later, we were told the decision had already been made at the corporate level, and the board review was procedural. A longer pause this time. That was when I understood that the decision had never been in the room we were allowed into. The recording shifted again, a different quality to the ambient sound, like she had moved to another space, or recorded this portion on a different day. When she spoke again, something in her voice had changed, still controlled, but carrying something heavier now, something she had clearly decided to say, and was choosing her way through carefully. "I want to be specific," she said, "because vague accusations help no one, and I'm not interested in being vague." James's jaw tightened. The development interest in the South Side corridor was not publicly connected to Whitmore Corporation in any documentation I could find. But the pressure on the board came through channels that were. A consulting firm with a listed address 2 floors below the Whitmore Corporation headquarters. A legal representative whose firm had handled 3 prior Whitmore acquisitions. And a name that appeared once, only once, in a forwarded internal email that someone sent me by mistake and asked me to delete. The room was absolutely silent, except for her voice. The name was not James Whitmore. She said it plainly, without drama, like it was important to her that this particular point be unmistakable. "I've thought about that man. I've thought about whether he knew what his signature was being used to accomplish. I don't know the answer to that. I genuinely don't. But I know that the man whose name did appear in that email, the one who appeared once and only once, in a message that was never meant for me, I know that he knew. I know that he had been knowing for a long time exactly what he was doing." A breath. "His name is Daniel Marsh." 3 words, quiet as everything else she had said, but with a weight to them that the quietness only made heavier, the way certain things become more serious, the more calmly they are stated. I'm recording this because I don't know how much time I have left to say it, and because Maya deserves to live in a world where what happened to us is on the record somewhere, even if it's just on this phone, even if no one ever finds it. The ambient sound shifted once more, closer now, more intimate. "That's all," Diana said. "That's everything I know." And then the recording ended. This time, the silence was complete. Not the waiting silence of before, not a silence that was holding its breath for something to follow. This was the silence of after, the kind that comes when something has been said that cannot be unsaid, when the air in a room has been permanently rearranged by the words that have moved through it. Maya reached over and picked up the phone. She held it with both hands and looked at the dark screen for a moment, and then she set it carefully in her lap, and she looked at James. Her voice, when it came, was very quiet, entirely steady. "Do you know who she was talking about?" James did not answer immediately. He was looking across the floor, past the empty assistant stations, past the row of closed office doors, past the hallway that curved away from the main space toward the far wing of the building, toward the office at the end. The light beneath Daniel Marsh's door was still on, at this hour, on this floor, with the building otherwise empty, and the cleaning crew still 2 hours away. The light was still on. James looked at it for a long moment. That thin line of gold beneath the closed door, steady and indifferent, the way a light stays on when the person inside it has no particular reason to leave. Then he looked back at Maya, and the answer to her question sat between them unspoken, taking up all the space in the room. James told Maya to stay where she was. He said it quietly, without explanation, and she looked at him for a moment with those assessing eyes of hers, and then nodded once, the nod of someone who understands that certain things need to happen without an audience, and who is old enough or has lived enough to know the difference. He walked down the hallway alone. The carpet absorbed his footsteps. The building hummed its low, continuous hum. The light beneath Daniel's door grew from a thin line to a rectangle as James approached, and he stood outside it for exactly as long as it took him to decide that there was no version of this conversation that benefited from delay. He opened the door without knocking. Daniel was at his desk, not pretending to work, not startled, not reaching for anything, just sitting with his jacket still on and his hands folded on the desk in front of him, like a man who had been expecting company and had made himself comfortable while he waited. The desk lamp threw a circle of light across the surface between them. Everything outside that circle was in shadow. He looked up when James entered. "Close the door," he said. James did. He did not sit down. The silence between them had a different quality than any silence James had experienced with this man before, and they had shared many silences over 20 years, the comfortable kind, the strategic kind, the kind that passes between people who have spent enough time together to communicate without words. This one was none of those things. "She recorded it," James said. Not a question. "I know," Daniel said. "You knew about Diana." Yes. The admission came without hesitation, without the defensive architecture that James had half expected. No redirection, no qualification, no careful pivot toward a more defensible position. Just yes, delivered in the same tone Daniel used, for everything the tone of a man, for whom most things were simply facts to be acknowledged and managed. "How long?" James asked. Daniel considered this, not because he didn't know the answer James understood, but because he was deciding how much of the answer was useful to give. "Long enough," he said finally. "I knew about her before you did. I knew about the child before this week." A pause. "I've known for several years." The words landed in the room and stayed there. James stood very still. "And the hospital," he said, "was a sound business decision." "That's not what I asked." Daniel held his gaze without difficulty. "The South Side corridor has been in our development pipeline for 4 years. The facility was an obstacle financially, structurally, practically. The community board was resistant but manageable. It required a certain amount of—" He paused, selecting the word with the precision of someone for whom language was always a tool. "Coordination." "You used my signature," James said. "I used your authority," Daniel said, as though the distinction mattered. "Which you extended to me, which you have always extended to me, because that is how we built what we built. You make the vision. I make the vision possible. That has been the arrangement for 20 years. The arrangement," James said, "did not include deciding what I was allowed to know about my own life." Something shifted in Daniel's expression. Not guilt, nothing as simple as guilt. Something more complex, and James thought more honest. The look of a man who has operated according to a system of logic that he genuinely believes in, confronting someone who does not share it. "You would have stopped," Daniel said. "If you had known about the woman, about the child, you would have pulled back from the development, restructured the timeline, cost us 18 months, and a significant anchor partnership." He said it without heat, without apology. "I made a judgment call. I have made 1,000 judgment calls on your behalf. And this company would not exist at the scale it exists without them." "You decided she wasn't worth telling me about," James said. "I decided," Daniel said carefully, "that certain information was not operationally relevant." The lamp hummed between them. "And this week," James said, "sending someone to bring Maya here. That was you." "The situation had moved beyond containable," Daniel said. "The footage was everywhere. Public sympathy was consolidating around the child. I needed to understand what she knew with what she had, and whether it could be managed. Bringing her here, a slight shift, of his hands on the desk was the most efficient way to assess that. "She's 10 years old," James said. "She's a variable," Daniel said. "In a situation that has significant implications for this company. I treated her accordingly." The word variable moved through the room like something physical. James looked at the man across the desk, at the face he had looked across conference tables for 2 decades. The face he had called at midnight during crises and trusted with decisions he hadn't wanted to make himself. The face that had been in every practical sense the most constant presence in his professional life. He looked at it now, the way you look at a document you have signed, without reading, with the particular, sickening clarity of someone who has just understood what they actually agreed to. Daniel met his gaze evenly. No performance of remorse, no appeal for understanding, just the calm, weathered steadiness of a man who has thought through his own position and found it on balance defensible. "I've been protecting you from yourself for 20 years, James," he said. "Every instinct you had that would have cost us something, every time you wanted to pull back, slow down, reconsider, I was the one who kept us moving." He paused. "Everything I did for this company." He said it the way people say things they have said to themselves so many times they have stopped hearing them. James stood in the circle of lamplight and looked at Daniel Marsh, and what he saw was not the man he had built something with, not the man he had trusted, absolutely not the version of Daniel that had accumulated across 20 years of proximity and shared purpose. What he saw was a man he had never met before in his life. The question came out of nowhere and everywhere at once. James had not planned to ask it, or rather, he had not known he was going to ask it until he heard himself say it, the words arriving fully formed from some place that had been holding them for longer than he realized. "Did Diana ever try to reach me?" The room shifted. It was subtle. Nothing moved. The lamp still threw the same circle of light. Daniel's hands were still folded on the desk in front of him. But something in the quality of the air between them changed the way air changes just before weather does. Daniel looked at him. For the first time in the entire conversation, he did not answer immediately. The silence stretched to 5 seconds. 10. Long enough that James understood it was not hesitation. Daniel Marsh did not hesitate, had never hesitated. It was one of the qualities James had most valued in him for 2 decades. This was something else. This was a man deciding, with his usual deliberate precision, whether the answer to a question was still something he could control the consequences of. He apparently decided it was not. He stood. He moved to the far side of the office, without speaking, to the built-in cabinet along the wall, dark wood, the kind of furniture that was meant to look like part of the room rather than storage. He produced a small key from his jacket pocket. James watched him unlock the bottom drawer with the careful, unhurried movements of someone who had opened it before and knew exactly what was inside. He reached in, he came back to the desk, and he set down a letter. It landed on the desk between them, with the soft, definitive sound of something that had been kept in one place for a very long time, finally being moved from it. The envelope was ivory, once white probably, but aged to the particular warm tone that paper takes when it has sat undisturbed in a drawer through enough seasons. It was sealed. The flap had never been opened, which James registered as a detail that somehow made everything worse rather than better. A small mercy he had not been granted the knowledge of, but that had apparently been extended in this one limited form. His name was on the front. James. Just the one word. No last name, no address, no formality of any kind, just his name in handwriting. He recognized the way you recognize a song you haven't heard in 15 years, immediately and completely, and from the very first note. The letters were rounded at the tops, slightly compressed, the J, with a particular loop at the base that she had always made. He had seen that handwriting on grocery lists and legal briefs and the margins of books she lent him and never asked back for. He had not seen it in 15 years. He looked at the envelope on the desk and did not touch it. Then he looked at Daniel. "She wrote this 10 years ago," Daniel said. His voice had not changed, Still the same measured register, still the same quality of a man reporting facts rather than confessing to them. She sent it to the office address. It came through the general correspondence intake, which I managed at the time. A pause. I made a decision. You made a decision, James repeated. I decided, Daniel said, that you were in a critical phase of the Hargrove acquisition, that the timing was poor, that certain personal disruptions. He stopped, chose again. I decided you didn't deserve to read it. The last sentence was different from the ones before it. Not in volume. Daniel did not raise his voice. But the phrasing was different. The architecture of it, the way deserve sat in the middle of it, like a load-bearing word. It was the first thing he had said all night that carried something personal in it. Not remorse, not quite, but something adjacent to it. Something that suggested this particular decision had lived in a different compartment than the others. James picked up the envelope. He held it with both hands, not gripping it, just holding it level. The way you carry something fragile. He looked at his name in her handwriting for a moment longer. Then he looked at Daniel one final time. There was nothing left to say that was worth saying in this room, to this man tonight. Everything that needed to be understood had been understood. Everything that needed to be seen had been seen. Continuing the conversation would only give Daniel more opportunity to apply his particular logic to things that were not, James had finally grasped, subject to logic at all. He walked to the door. James? Daniel's voice still measured, still controlled, but with something in it now that James had not heard before. Not urgency, exactly. Something closer to the sound of a man who has just realized that the thing he said last was not, in fact, the last thing that needed to be said. James opened the door. James, there are things you need to understand about the legal exposure here. If you take that recording and... The hallway carpet absorbed his footsteps. The distance between Daniel's doorway and the main area of the floor was perhaps 40 feet. James covered it in the particular way of someone who is not moving away from something so much as moving deliberately, and finally, toward something else, though he could not have named yet what that something was. He did not look back. Behind him, Daniel's voice continued for a few more words, still controlled, still reasonable, still making the case for the framework. It had always made the case for, and then it stopped. Not because Daniel had given up, James understood, but because Daniel had recognized with the same precision he applied to everything that the audience was gone. The door to the main space was still open. Maya was in the chair where he had left her awake, the phone in her lap, watching him cross the floor toward her, with the quiet, patient attention of someone who has learned that the most important information usually arrives without announcement. James sat down in the chair beside her. He set the envelope on his knee and looked at it. He did not open it. Not yet. He asked Ruth to come. He wasn't sure why he still had her number. He had put it in his phone that afternoon at the resource center. Out of some instinct he hadn't examined. And now, sitting in the chair, beside a child who was fighting sleep with the stubborn determination of someone who did not want to miss anything important, he was glad he had. Ruth arrived 40 minutes later and took in the situation with the practiced calm of a woman who had seen many variations of difficult nights. She spoke quietly to Maya, who looked at James once before allowing herself to be guided toward a small rest area down the hall, where the overnight staff sometimes slept between shifts. At the doorway, Maya turned back. She didn't say anything. She just looked at him and at the envelope in his hands. And then she nodded, a small, serious nod, the kind that means I understand, from someone who understands more than they should have to. Then she went. James took the envelope into his own office and closed the door. He did not turn on the overhead lights. The desk lamp was enough a warm, contained circle that made the rest of the room recede into something approximate to privacy, which was the closest he was going to get tonight. He set the envelope on the desk in front of him and sat down and looked at it for a while longer, his name in her handwriting. James. He had been putting off this moment since he picked the envelope up from Daniel's desk, managing the delay the way he managed most uncomfortable things, by keeping himself in motion, keeping the next task ahead of the current one, keeping the machinery of action running fast enough that feeling had difficulty finding a foothold. There was nothing left to do now. He opened the envelope. The letter was 3 pages, written on both sides of 2 sheets, and then continuing on to a third, not the careful, composed writing of someone who had drafted and revised, but the looser, more urgent hand of someone who had sat down and simply written until they were finished. The ink was blue. The date at the top was 10 years ago, a Tuesday in November. James, I've started this letter 4 times. I'm going to finish it this time, even if it doesn't come out the way I want it to, because I've realized that waiting until I find the right words is just another way of not sending it. I'm not writing to ask you for anything. I want to say that first, because I know you and I know your first instinct when you read this will be to start calculating what's being asked of you and what the reasonable response is. I'm not asking for anything. I just want you to know some things. James set the page down, picked it up again. I have a daughter. Her name is Maya. She's 4 months old, and she has a full head of hair, and she grabs onto whatever is closest when she's startled, which lately has been my finger. And I won't pretend that doesn't make everything harder and better at the same time. I made decisions about how to handle this situation, and I stand by them. I'm not going to get into all of that here, because it would take too long, and because some of it still makes me angry. And I don't want to write an angry letter. I've written those. I didn't send them. The faintest thing crossed his face at that. What I want to tell you about is her. Not what she means for you or for us, or for anything complicated. Just her. She started smiling last week. Not the reflex kind, the real kind. The kind where she sees your face, and something in her decides that this is good, this is worth responding to. She smiles, like someone who has thought it over, and concluded that yes, this is a reasonable thing to be happy about. I don't know where she gets that from. Maybe you. You always needed a reason for everything. James stopped reading. The room was very quiet. He started again. She's going to be someone who pays attention. I can tell already. She watches everything, not anxiously, just carefully. The way some people move through the world, taking notes. She's going to ask hard questions, and she's going to want real answers. I think she's going to be the kind of person who makes other people better at being honest. I hope she gets to do all of it. I hope the world gives her room. The 3rd page was shorter. The handwriting was slightly different, maybe written on a different day or in a different state of mind. More deliberate. Each word more carefully placed. I'm not going to tell her about you, not yet, maybe not for a long time. That's my decision to make right now, and I'm making it. But I'm writing this down because things happen, and I want there to be a record somewhere that says she is loved. She has always been loved. Whatever else is true, that is true. And I want there to be a record that says I didn't disappear from your life without trying once to reach back. Take care of yourself. You were a good man, James. I think you might still be underneath everything you've built on top of it. The last line. Her name is Maya. She has your eyes. Please, if you ever find her, don't make the same mistake twice. James read the last line again. And then again. He set the pages down on the desk with the careful, deliberate movements of someone operating in a space where carelessness feels like a kind of sin. He smoothed the edges with his fingers. He aligned them with the corner of the desk. And then he put his face in his hands. It started somewhere, in the chest, not a sound. Not at first, just a pressure that had no outlet, that had been building through days and years, and a long, accumulating weight of things left undone and unsaid and willfully unexamined. It moved upward and outward, and eventually it had nowhere left to go. He had not cried in 20 years. He had in that time convinced himself that this was a form of strength, sitting alone at his desk in the dark with Diana's letter in front of him. He understood with the absolute clarity that only arrives at the very bottom of things that it had been nothing of the kind. He washed his face in the small bathroom off the main corridor before he went back out. Cold water, both hands longer than necessary. He looked at himself in the mirror for a moment. Not the evaluating look he usually gave his reflection. The quick inventory of presentation and composure before a meeting, but something more direct than that. Something that had less to do with how he appeared and more to do with simply acknowledging that he was here in this building at this hour, having arrived at this particular place by a series of choices that had seemed each individually entirely reasonable. He dried his face. He turned off the light. The main area of the 42nd floor was quiet, in the way that offices are quiet at 3 in the morning. Not empty exactly. Just abandoned the furniture and the equipment and the carefully maintained surfaces, all present and waiting for the people who would return in a few hours to give them purpose again. The overnight cleaning crew had come and gone while he was in his office. Everything smelled faintly of something neutral and clean. Maya was in the chair where Ruth had left her. She had not made it to the rest area down the hall, or had made it there and come back, which he suspected was more likely. She was curled sideways in the large chair, her knees drawn up her head, resting on the chair's wide arm, at an angle that looked deeply uncomfortable in the way that children's sleeping positions always do. And her right hand was still loosely wrapped around her mother's phone. Even in sleep, the way you hold something you have decided not to let go of, regardless of what your body does. James stood at the edge of the hallway and looked at her for a moment. There was a particular quality to watching a child sleep that he had no previous experience of, a combination of stillness and vulnerability that operated at a frequency entirely different from anything in his professional life, where stillness usually meant strategy and vulnerability was something to be managed rather than witnessed. This was neither of those things. This was just a small person resting, taking up very little space, breathing, with the uncomplicated rhythm of someone whose body had simply decided it was done for the day. He pulled a chair from against the wall quietly, the legs lifting rather than sliding, and set it down beside hers. He sat. He was not sure how long he sat there before she stirred. It might have been 10 minutes. It might have been more. He had stopped checking his watch somewhere around the time he opened Diana's letter, and he found he had no particular interest in starting again. The city beyond the windows was doing what it always did, moving, glowing, continuing, but at this hour, it had a different quality, a kind of candor that the daytime didn't allow for, as though the dark had stripped away everything performative and left only what was actually there. Maya's eyes opened gradually, the way eyes open when sleep releases someone gently, rather than being interrupted. She oriented herself, without apparent alarm, taking in the room the chair, her own position, and then she turned her head and found him sitting beside her, and she looked at him with the unsurprised expression of someone who had half expected him to be there. "Hi," she said. Her voice was soft with sleep. "Hi," he said. That was all for a while. She pushed herself upright, slowly, settling back into the chair properly, and rubbed one eye with the back of her hand in the unself-conscious way of children who have not yet learned to be embarrassed by the ordinary evidence of being human. She looked at the windows, at the city. "It's late," she said. "It is," he agreed. "Did you read it?" He understood what she was asking, without needing clarification. "Yes," he said. She nodded, looking at the city. She did not ask him what it said. He did not offer. The information passed between them in the way that certain things pass between people who are not yet sure of the exact nature of their relationship, but have established, through the events of a single extraordinary day, something that functions like trust. The silence between them was not the silence of two people who had nothing to say. It was the silence of two people who had too much to say and had both independently reached the conclusion that none of it needed to be said right now, in this particular hour, in this particular place. It was, James realized, the most comfortable silence he had experienced in recent memory. He was not sure what that said about the rest of his life, but he suspected it said something worth examining. Maya looked out at the city for a while longer. Then she looked down at the phone in her hand, the cracked screen, the scratched case, the thin line of wear along one edge where years of pockets and bags had worked at the material. She turned it over once. Then she held it out toward him. Not quickly, not as a transaction. With the careful, considered deliberateness of someone who has thought about whether to do something and has decided that yes, this is the right thing, and is now doing it in a way that matches the weight of the decision. "You can keep this," she said. Her voice was quiet, sure of itself. "I think Mom would have wanted you to hear it properly." A small pause. "Not just the part at the end, all of it, from the beginning." James looked at the phone. He looked at her hand, holding it out to him, small, steady, unhesitating, and at the expression on her face, which was not performing generosity, or seeking approval, or doing any of the things that gestures sometimes do when they are more about the person making them than the person receiving them. She was simply giving him something that she had decided he should have. He reached out and took it. The phone was lighter than he expected, warmer from being held. He set it carefully on his knee, beside the folded letter he had carried out of his office, without thinking about it, and he looked at both of them, the worn phone and the ivory envelope sitting there, in the half-dark of a building he owned, on a floor he had designed, in a city he had helped shape, and he thought about how very small and very significant they both were, and how strange it was that these two things between them contained everything that actually mattered. The city changed color before it changed anything else. That was how Atlanta announced itself in the early morning. Not with sound, not yet, but with light. The sky to the east went from the deep, solid black of actual night to something softer and more complicated, a gradient that moved through gray, and then through a color that had no good name somewhere between purple and the memory of purple, and then finally to the first pale suggestion of gold along the tops of the buildings. James became aware of it gradually, the way you become aware of something that has been changing slowly for a long time. He had not slept. He did not think Maya had either fully. She had drifted in and out in the chair beside him, surfacing occasionally, and then settling again, her breathing shifting between the deep rhythm of sleep and the lighter, more conscious rhythm of someone resting while remaining present. At some point, she had moved from the chair to sit beside him on the low bench beneath the windows, which he had not entirely registered until she was already there. And by then, it had seemed like exactly the right arrangement. The phone and the letter were on the windowsill in front of them. Outside, Atlanta was beginning. He started talking without deciding to. That was the only way he knew how to say it afterward. Not that he chose the moment, but that the moment arrived, and he recognized it as the only one there was going to be. And so he simply began. "Her name was Diana," he said. Maya was looking at the window. She did not turn her head. "I know," she said quietly. "I knew her a long time ago. Before you were born. Before any of this." He paused, looked at his hands. "She was the most honest person I had ever met. That was the thing about her. She always said exactly what was true, even when it cost her something." Maya said nothing, listening. "I left," he said. "It was a Tuesday. I had reasons, the kind of reasons that seem sufficient when you're in the middle of constructing them. The company, the timing, the idea that there would be better moments later, when things were more settled, when I was more settled." He stopped. "There were never better moments. There was just the moment I chose not to stay in." Outside, a light came on in a building across the street. Then another, the city waking up one window at a time. "I didn't know she tried to write to me," he said. "The letter? I want you to know that I didn't know." "I believe you," Maya said. The simplicity of it, no qualifier, no hesitation. Just, "I believe you," the way you state something that is simply true, moved through him, like water finding level. "The hospital," he said. "The decision to close it. I signed something I hadn't read carefully enough, and a man I trusted made sure I didn't read it carefully enough, because he knew that if I had, I would have asked different questions." He kept his eyes on the window. "That is not an excuse. I am telling you what happened, not asking you to forgive the outcome. Those are different things." Maya had her knees pulled up again, her arms wrapped loosely around them, looking at the glass and the city beyond it. Her profile, in the early morning light, was very still and very focused, the face of someone taking in information and finding places for it, sorting it not into anger or sorrow, but into understanding. "Did you know about me?" she asked. "Before this week?" "No," he said. "Okay," she said. Just that. Okay. Not absolution, not accusation, just the acknowledgement of a fact being placed where it belonged. They sat with that for a while. The sky was properly gold now, along the horizon, the kind of gold that doesn't last, that the full arrival of morning would dilute into ordinary blue. It was the best few minutes of most days, the ones that people who weren't awake for them never knew to miss. She was brave, James said. Not planning to, just saying what was true. "Your mother." She went and stood in front of a board of people who had already decided what they were going to do, and she made her argument anyway, because she thought it was right. And when that didn't work, she kept records. She kept the recording. She made sure there was a version of the truth that existed somewhere, even if she never knew whether anyone would find it. Maya was quiet for a moment. "She always said that," she said, "that you have to say the true thing even when no one's listening, because you don't actually know who's listening." "She was right," James said. "She was right about a lot of things," Maya said. There was no bitterness in it, just the calm, clear assessment of someone stating facts about a person they knew well and had thought about carefully. Another silence. This one had a different texture than the ones before, less weighted, less full of things unsaid. More like the silence between two people who have said enough for now and are simply occupying the same space while the world moves around them. The gold on the horizon deepened and then began, as it always did, to give way to something less dramatic and more sustainable. The first sounds of traffic reached them through the glass, muffled and distant, the city's daily machinery starting up. Maya unfolded her arms. She looked at the window, not at the city exactly, but at the glass, at the point where the inside met the outside, the thin boundary between here and everything else. "Are you going to fix it?" she asked. Her voice was the same as it had been all morning, quiet, unhurried, asking the question, the way she asked all questions, as though the answer mattered more than the asking of it. "The hospital, I mean." She paused. "Because Mom always said the building doesn't matter. The people inside do." James looked at her profile in the morning light. He thought about 30 years of buildings, about what he had built and why he had built it, and what he had told himself it was for. He thought about a signature on a document he hadn't read, and a key in a locked drawer, and a recording made by a woman who had understood better than he had what actually mattered and what was simply structure. He thought about Diana standing in front of a board that had already decided making her argument anyway. He did not answer immediately. But for the first time in a very long time, the answer that was forming in him had nothing to do with strategy or positioning or the careful calculation of cost and benefit. It was just the answer. 7 days is not a long time in the context of a life or a career or the kind of institutional machinery that moves slowly. By design, 7 days is barely enough to change anything. James had spent 30 years understanding. This had built an entire philosophy of patience around it. The idea that things worth building take the time they take and cannot be rushed without being damaged. But 7 days, it turned out, was exactly long enough to decide who you were going to be. The ballroom of the Atlanta Grand was the same room. Same floor-to-ceiling windows. Same rows of chairs, arranged in the careful geometry of managed communication. Same cluster of cameras along the back wall. The same reporters with the same notebooks, and the same recording devices, and the same practiced expressions of professional skepticism. James stood at the same podium. Everything else was different. There was no press secretary standing off stage with a printed outline of approved talking points. There was no legal team in the front row, signaling with subtle gestures when answers ran long. There was no Daniel Marsh anywhere in the building. Daniel, who had been escorted from the Whitmore Corporation offices 6 days ago by 2 individuals from the state attorney's office, carrying a briefcase and wearing the expression of a man who had known for some time that a particular bill would eventually come due. James had no notes. He had thought about preparing some. He had sat at his desk the evening before with a legal pad and a pen and the intention of organizing his thoughts into something structured and deliverable. And after 40 minutes, he had put the pen down and accepted that what he needed to say did not benefit from organization. It simply needed to be said. He adjusted the microphone. He looked at the room. 7 days ago, he said, a 10-year-old girl walked into this room and told me something true. I'm here today because of what she said, and because of what I learned in the days that followed, and because I have spent the last week trying to determine whether I was the kind of person who acts on what he learns, or the kind who finds reasons not to. The room was quiet in a way it had not been quiet the last time he stood here. Whitmore Corporation's involvement in the closure of Southside Community Hospital was not, as I previously understood it, a straightforward business decision executed through standard channels. Evidence has come to light, including recorded testimony, indicating that the process was manipulated at a senior level, that the Community Review Board was subjected to coordinated pressure, and that documentation was managed in ways designed to limit my awareness of the full situation. He paused. I am not telling you this to absolve myself. I signed the authorization. My signature is on the document. The fact that I did not fully understand what I was authorizing does not change what happened to the people who depended on that facility. I want to be clear about that. A reporter near the front raised a hand. James held up one finger, not dismissively, but in the way of someone who has more to say before questions begin. The individual primarily responsible for the manipulation of this process is Daniel Marsh, who served as my chief operating officer for 20 years. That matter is now in the hands of the appropriate authorities, and I will not speak further about it here because it is no longer mine to manage. He glanced briefly at the table beside the podium where a folder sat closed. Separately, a development interest that benefited from the closure of the facility has been identified as having a relationship with the coordination effort. That relationship is currently under formal review. He opened the folder. Whitmore Corporation will fund the complete reconstruction and reopening of Southside Community Hospital. The facility will operate as a nonprofit community health center in perpetuity with a governance structure that prevents any future acquisition or closure by private development interests. He set the paper down. Construction begins in 60 days. The room reacted, not with applause, not with the contained professional murmur of a standard announcement, but with the particular slightly unsteady energy of a group of people recalibrating in real time. Additionally, James said, and the room resettled into attention, I will be stepping down as Chief Executive Officer of Whitmore Corporation, effective at the end of this quarter. The company will undergo an independent structural review, and I will remain available to that process in whatever capacity is useful. But the organization needs leadership that is not at this moment me. He paused. I think I have some other things to attend to. He closed the folder. He looked out at the room, at the cameras, at the notebooks, at the 30-some faces, pointed in his direction, all of them running their various calculations about what this meant and what came next and how to frame it for their respective audiences. Then, a reporter in the third row, young, with the slightly rumpled look of someone who had filed 3 stories before 9 in the morning, raised her hand and spoke before being called on. Mr. Whitmore, what changed? The question landed in the room simply, without agenda, the way honest questions sometimes do. James looked at her for a moment. Then his gaze moved past the cameras, past the press pool, past the first few rows of industry observers and legal representatives who had shown up to watch whatever this turned out to be, to the row near the back. Ruth was there, in a gray cardigan, sitting with the straight-backed composure of someone who had seen a great many things and reserved judgment on most of them. Beside her, in a chair that was slightly too tall for her, so that her feet didn't quite reach the floor, was Maya. She was not performing anything. She was not watching the cameras or looking around at the room or doing any of the things that most people do when they are in a space like this. She was just watching him with the same direct, unhurried attention she had turned on him in a 42nd floor office 8 days ago, in the chair outside a room he'd locked himself in the pale light of an Atlanta morning. The same eyes, something that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one, moved across her face. Small, private, the expression of someone watching a thing they hoped would happen actually happen. James looked at her for a moment longer than was probably visible to anyone in the room. Then he looked back at the reporter. "Someone told me the truth," he said. "And I was paying attention." The room emptied the way rooms empty after things that matter gradually, with the particular reluctance of people who sense that what just happened is worth staying near for a little longer, even if they can't quite articulate why. James stayed at the podium until the last of the questions had been asked and answered, and then he stepped away from the microphone and let the publicist his legal team had insisted on hiring for the morning handle the follow-up conversations, the business cards, the requests for written statements. He had said what he came to say. The rest was logistics. He found Ruth first, near the side exit, helping Maya with her jacket. The same oversized jacket from 8 days ago. James noticed the one with the slightly frayed cuffs and the collar that sat a little unevenly. Maya was doing the zipper herself, with the focused concentration of someone who has decided that certain things should be done independently. Ruth looked up when James approached. She held his gaze for a moment with the appraising steadiness he had come to recognize as simply how she looked at things, not unkindly, just honestly. "That was the right thing," she said. She said it the way Diana used to say things that were true without inflation, without the performance of generosity. Just the fact of it, placed where it belonged. Then she touched Maya's shoulder briefly and said she would bring the car around, and she walked toward the exit with the efficient, unhurried gait of a woman who had somewhere to be and was confident she would get there. And then it was just the two of them in the thinning crowd of a room that was already being rearranged by hotel staff into whatever it was needed to be next. Maya looked up at him. "You didn't use notes," she said. "No," he said. "Mom said people who use a lot of notes usually aren't saying what they actually think." She considered this. "I think she meant it as a compliment for the people who don't use them." "I'll take it as one," James said. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. The 3 bills were there, had been there since the morning of the press conference, carried through 8 days of the strangest week of his life, moving from jacket to jacket each morning in the careful, unexamined way that certain objects get carried when you are not ready to examine why you're still carrying them. They were more worn now than they had been when Maya placed them on the podium. The handling had softened them further. The edges, more frayed, the paper thinner at the folds. He held them out to her. Maya looked at them in his hand. She did not reach for them. "Those are yours," James said. "They were always yours. I shouldn't have—" He stopped, started more simply. "I want you to have them back." Maya looked at the bills for a moment longer, with the particular expression she got when she was thinking something through properly. "Why did you keep them?" she asked. It was as her questions tended to be more direct than it appeared. "Because they're the reason I'm standing here," he said. "Because everything that happened this week started with you walking into that room and putting them down in front of me, and I didn't want to forget that." He paused. "I still don't." Maya reached out, and for a moment he thought she was going to take them. But instead, she folded his fingers back over them gently, with both of her small hands around his closed fist, and then she stepped back. "Keep it," she said, "so you don't forget." Her voice was certain in the way that his had not been certain about anything for 20 years. James looked at his closed hand, at the slight pressure that remained where her hands had been already fading. He put the bills back in his pocket. They walked out through the side exit, into the October morning, the Atlanta air, cool and bright, carrying the particular clarity that sometimes follows a long night. The street outside the hotel was still busy with departing vehicles and lingering reporters filing their updates, but the side entrance opened onto a quieter stretch of sidewalk, and they walked slowly, without any particular destination, in the unhurried way of people who have arrived somewhere and are not yet thinking about where they are going next. "Tell me something about her," James said. "Something small, something I wouldn't know." Maya thought about it for half a block. "She couldn't whistle," she said. "She tried all the time. Every time she heard a song she liked, she'd try to whistle it, and it never worked. It just came out as air, a pause. But she kept trying, every single time." James walked with that for a moment. "That sounds like her," he said. Maya glanced up at him. "You actually knew her," she said. Not a question more, like something she was trying on, placing against what she already understood, and seeing how it fit. "I did," he said. "Not as well as I should have, not as carefully as she deserved." He watched the sidewalk in front of them. "But I knew her." They walked in silence for a while. Not the weighted silence of unfinished things, but something easier. The silence of two people who have said enough for now and are simply moving through the same morning at the same pace. "The hospital," Maya said eventually. "When it opens, can I come?" "I was going to ask if you'd cut the ribbon," James said. She was quiet for a moment. "Mom would think that was funny," she said. "In a good way." "I think so too," he said. They reached the corner where Ruth's car was idling at the curb. Maya stopped and turned to face him with the directness that was simply how she moved through the world. No preamble, no working up to it, just the thing itself. She reached out and took his hand. Not the way children hold hands to cross streets or stay close in crowds. Just took it, held it for a moment with the same quiet certainty she brought to everything. "Mom said good people make mistakes," she said. "She said the difference is what they do after." She looked at him steadily, the way she had looked at him across a podium 8 days ago, with those eyes that had been looking at the world straight on for as long as she could remember, and would keep looking at it that way. He understood now, regardless of what the world did in response. Then she let go and turned and got into Ruth's car. The door closed. The car pulled into traffic. James stood on the sidewalk with 3 crumpled dollars in his jacket pocket and the ghost of a small hand in his, and he watched the car until it turned the corner and was gone. 6 months is enough time for a foundation to be poured, walls to be raised, and a building to become something that people can walk into and trust with the things that matter most to them. It is also James had learned enough time to begin to understand the difference between the life you built and the life you were actually living inside it. The morning of the opening was clear and cool, the particular freshness of an Atlanta April that reminds you the city has seasons, even when it seems to have forgotten. The street in front of the new facility had been closed to traffic for the ceremony, and by 8:30, there were already more people gathered on the sidewalk than the organizers had planned for residents from the surrounding block staff, from the neighboring community organizations, a contingent from the elementary school 2 streets over whose students had, according to their teacher, been talking about this morning for 3 weeks. Someone had brought a banner, hand-lettered, slightly uneven, the kind made at someone's kitchen table, rather than ordered from a print shop. "Welcome back. We missed you." James stood near the back of the gathered crowd. This had been a decision, not an accident. He had arrived early enough to have taken any position he wanted center stage, beside the podium, anywhere the cameras would find him naturally. He had walked to the back of the crowd instead, and stood among the people who had come because the building meant something to them, and he had found somewhat to his own surprise that it was exactly where he wanted to be. The building itself was 4 stories, the same footprint as the original, rebuilt, with the structural updates the old facility had needed for years and never received. The brick was new, but chosen to match the neighborhood's existing palette, so that the building looked like it had always intended to be here, rather than like something that had arrived to replace something else. Above the main entrance, in clean sans serif letters, the name Diana Community Hospital. James had suggested it. The board had approved it without discussion, which he took to mean it was right. Ruth was near the front, standing with a group of longtime residents. She seemed to know well, laughing at something one of them had said, with the full, unguarded laugh of a person who is genuinely happy about where they are standing this morning. And Maya was at the entrance. She was in a blue dress, not the oversized jacket, not the careful neatness of institutional clothing, but something that had clearly been chosen for today, specifically, with the collar slightly askew, in the way of someone who put it on themselves and didn't use a mirror. She was holding one end of a wide, red ribbon that stretched across the entrance, her other hand resting lightly on the handle of a pair of scissors that were almost comically large for her. A woman from the city council said a few words. Then the chair of the new hospital's community board said a few more. James had been asked to speak and had declined, which had surprised the organizers and had not surprised Ruth at all. He watched from the back as Maya looked out at the gathered crowd with the same unhurried attention she brought to everything, taking it in, finding it acceptable, concluding that, yes, this was a reasonable thing to be happy about. Then she cut the ribbon. The crowd responded with the particular warmth of people who have been waiting for something for a long time and are relieved finally to have it. The ribbon fell in two pieces, the doors opened, and the people of Southside, Atlanta, walked into their hospital for the first time in 14 months, carrying with them the ordinary and essential things that communities carry into places like this, their worries and their children, and their hope that someone on the other side of a door will be able to help. James watched them go in. He was still holding the $3. He had transferred them again that morning, from yesterday's jacket to today's, without thinking about it, and then had thought about it, standing at his closet, and had decided that thinking about it was beside the point. Some things you carry because you need reminding. Some reminders are worth the wait. Maya found him at the back of the crowd when the ceremony had settled into the informal movement of people making their way inside. She walked over with the scissors still in her hand, apparently having forgotten to give them back, and stood beside him and looked at the building with the satisfied expression of someone reviewing completed work. "It's bigger than I thought it would be," she said. "Buildings usually are," James said, "when they're actually there." She considered this with the seriousness it may or may not have deserved. They stood together, watching the last of the crowd filter through the entrance, the banner swaying slightly in the April air, the city going about its morning around them, with the indifference and the continuity that cities maintain, regardless of what individuals are experiencing within them. There is something a 10-year-old girl knew on the morning she walked into a room full of cameras and powerful people and placed $3 on a podium. She knew it not as a theory or a strategy or a calculated act. She knew it the way children sometimes know things that adults have spent years forgetting, that the size of a gesture has nothing to do with the size of what it costs you, that the people who are supposed to be paying attention are not always the ones who actually are, that sometimes the most important thing you can do is walk into a room where you are not expected and say the true thing out loud, even if your voice is small, even if your feet don't quite reach the floor, even if the person across from you has $4 billion and you have 3. That morning, Maya had known something she couldn't quite put into words yet, that sometimes $3 is worth more than 4 billion. And sometimes the most powerful thing in the world is a child who still believes that people can change. James reached into his pocket. The 3 bills were there softer now than they had ever been worn to something closer to cloth than paper, carrying in their fibers the particular history of everything they had passed through. He held them for a moment. Then he put them back. Some things you keep. If this story reached you, if something in it felt true, we'd love to hear from you. What would you do if you had the chance to fix your biggest mistake? Leave your answer below. And if you know someone who needs to hear that it's not too late, share this with them. That's the whole point.